Hello everyone, and welcome to the most awaited clash of the Olympiad. It's Fabiano Caruana of the United States, and he's facing Shahriar Mamedjarov of Azerbaijan. A true clash of titans on board one. Two of them, along Magnus Carlsen, are, also along Ding Liren, as he is now the fourth member of the 2800 club. So a nice clash of 2800s, and it's... the opening is completely a theoretical struggle, as you would expect from such high-rated players. And we're gonna skip the opening in its entirety, since it's been played so many times by so many players, but it will really show you how much preparation really counts in these high-level battles. So without further ado, let's check out a couple of photos. There we have a nice photo by David Lada. As you can see, everything is in order. Really enjoying the boards. They are quite exquisite, and as you can see, Caruana still refusing to wear his blue blazer, as he doesn't want to be mistaken for a 1950s hamburger joint worker. And here we have a very nice photo of Mamedjarov, also by David Lada. So having seen these, let's check out the game. Like we said, e4, e5, we have knight to f3, knight to c6, and the bishop to b5, Duri Lopez. a6, bishop to a4, knight to f6, and castles. So Morphy's defense is on the board, knight captures on e4, d4, and now b5. This is the same opening Caruana and Mamedjarov have already played, but we're gonna get back to that. Bishop to b3, we have d5, and now d captures on e5. Bishop to e6, knight b to d2, knight to c5, going after the bishop on b3. Here we have c3, and now bishop to e7. It's also possible to capture the bishop on b3, but this position was analyzed so many times that it doesn't really do anything all that much for black. Bishop to e7, and now bishop back to c2. d4. We have knight to b3, and now comes even d3. So black creates this very powerful d3 pawn, and although it seems like black is dominating here, it's actually a very well known theoretical line that both of them have already played. Bishop to b1, we have knight captures on b3, a captures on b3, and now bishop to f5. And this is the position that I was talking about. Here, Caruana already had this position on the board against Mamedjarov. He had it in St. Louis Rapid event in 2018, where Caruana proceeded with pawn to b4. And also, Mamedjarov had this position against Anand, also in 2018 in the Sinquefield Cup, and that game was drawn. But the game where Fabiano played before that game, Fabiano also won against Mamedjarov. So bishop to e3. Seems like a new move, but it's not. The game will actually transpose into the exact same game Anand already played against Mamedjarov. So we have castles here, and this is still completely the same. Bishop to d4, queen to d5, we have rook to e1, and now d2. Still, this is still considered old standard theory. Rook to e2, getting the rook out of the way, now attacking the d2 pawn, and now comes bishop captures on b1. Rook captures on b1, and now knight captures on d4. We have knight captures on d4, and now comes bishop to g5, defending the d2 pawn. And here we have g3. This is the first move where Caruana spent some time. All of the moves up until this point were played in a matter of seconds. So the only move where Caruana started thinking was g3, but still he only spent 1 minute and 49 moves on g3. So okay, we have c5, knight goes to f5, and now comes queen to d3. Knight back to d6, we have queen to g6 and h4. And now again we transpose into the exact same position Vishwanathan Anand had against Shahriar Mamedjarov, where Anand played h4 and Mamedjarov continued with bishop to h6 in the Sinquefield Cup, where they drew their game. And here you can see that Mamedjarov came prepared to this game against Caruana. The only improved move for black is the engine line, that is bishop to f4, and this is in fact what Mamedjarov plays. So hard to say if this actually came as a surprise for Caruana or not, but for his next move, which is the strongest reply, Caruana plays knight back to e4, which took him some 10 minutes. You have to be careful. If you want to play a move like king to h2 to simply unpin, now threaten to capture the bishop, then bishop captures on e5. Very simple. Rook captures, now the knight is no longer defended. The pawn on d2 is now defended by the queen. Rook a8 is coming, and all of a sudden black is much better here. So knight to e4 by Caruana. We have f5, kicking the knight back, and now e captures on f6 is a possibility. You can capture here, but then rook a to e8, white gets a lot of development for this pawn, and you can't just keep on grabbing pawns, because here black would be the one that would be stronger. And the d2 pawn cannot be captured, because after knight captures, rook captures rook, queen captures rook, and now you simply remove the defender, and you notice that the queen is actually eyeing this rook. So after you move the rook, bishop goes back, and black is up a piece with a better position. So after f5, we have knight captures on d2. Caruana has to eliminate this very strong passed pawn, and now rook a to d8, pinning the knight. Rook to a1, getting the rook out of the way, so if the position opens, the queen will not be attacking it via this diagonal, and also pressuring a6 here. We have rook f to e8, and now comes queen to e1. And now Mamedyarov decides to exchange. We have bishop captures on d2, rook captures on d2, rook captures on d2, queen captures on d2, and now comes rook captures on e5. Queen to d8 check, rook defends with an attack on the queen. Queen to d5 check, we have queen to e6, and now rook to d1. And here, the material on the board is completely equal. Mamedyarov's pawn structure is even somewhat better, as white's b pawns are doubled, but it's not really all that important, as Mamedyarov's rook will not have the opportunity to attack the b2 pawn, whereas the a6 pawn is somewhat vulnerable. So it's in fact white who is better here. And here, if you decide to capture here, sure, this is possible. After rook captures, now the c pawn and the f pawn are under attack. But now rook to e2 is a very strong move. And now after captures and captures on b2, the b3 pawn is under attack, and after you defend it, black defends the f5 pawn, and now it's a pretty drawn endgame. But Mamedyarov doesn't go for this. In fact, he could have also gone for f4, simply deciding to trade it down even further on the king side to further improve the drawing of this game, but he decides to go for c4. He goes for some complications. And okay, b captures on c4, b captures on c4, and now queen to b7. Now the queen trade is no longer an option for Mamedyarov, and Caruana now does seem to have the upper hand, as these pawns are somewhat weak. So okay, rook to e7, and Mamedyarov attacks Caruana's queen. We have rook to d8 check, king to f7, and now queen back to f3. And now it doesn't really matter what the engine evaluation is. You can see that the king on f7, the rook cutting off the king, it's not a very pleasant position for black to be in. Here g6 is played. Something like rook to e8, it's pretty much all the same. After something like rook to d5 with a double attack against this pawn, g6 would have still been played, so why not to do it immediately? We have g6, and now comes queen to f4. And here, queen to c6, a very nice move by Mamedyarov. If you try something like queen to e1 check, and then go for some mating ideas here, or try to win the queen, it's actually black who would get checkmated after queen captures on c4. You can't find safety anywhere, for example on h6, because rook to g8 check, king h6, and now queen to f4 will lead to checkmate after queen g5. So after queen to f4, queen to c6, and here we have rook to d1, getting you have to protect the first rank. If you try something else instead of this rook to d1 move, for example, if you try something like rook to d6, then you would get checkmated after rook to e1. King moves, and now rook to h1 is checkmate, as the queen from c6 is so conveniently covering the h1 square. Okay, after queen to c6, rook to d1, Caruana has to bring the rook back, and here we have rook to e4, attacking the queen. Queen to h6, now attacking the h7 pawn, king goes back to g8. And now you don't really gain anything by rook d8, black simply brings his own rook back, rook to e8, so we have h5 here. Caruana wants to break open the king's defenses. Rook back to e8, we have pawn captures, and now king to f1. A very nice move, because now Caruana can activate his rook, as there are no more rook to e1 ideas. The king is now guarding the e1 square. Rook to e6 with a further protection of the g6 pawn, and now we have queen to h4. A very nice geometry by white here, guarding the d8 square, hoping that this rook will come to d8. So rook to e8, simply not allowing this, but now comes rook to d4. And now this comes with a double attack against the c4 pawn. And here it's very difficult to find an actual defensive move against rook captures on c4. And here you see what Carlsen will face in November. To play against Caruana, he will have to find a very nice engine line, like pawn to a5, where you can see that now that you know this, of course, after rook captures on c4, queen to b7, and now the b2 pawn is under attack. So black would actually be fine here. After a move like rook to c5, queen captures here, and here it would be actually very hard for white to get out of trouble. Ideas like queen to b1 to d3 are coming, and the rook will now be a very dangerous piece. And it's most likely white that will have to go for some perpetual ideas with queen to c4 to d4. But okay, after rook to d4, Mamedyarov decides to play rook to c8. Now, he does defend the pawn, but this simply doesn't work. We have queen to h6. And what do you do now? Now you see that the queen and rook are guarding the pawn, but they are so far away from protecting the king side, and now rook to h4 is definitely an idea here. So queen to e6, but now comes rook to h4 as planned. King to f7, Mamedyarov tries to run away with the king, queen to h7. This comes with check, king to f6, and now rook to d4. We have queen to e7, deciding to trade queens, but of course Caruana is not interested in this. And here you really see what kind of a person you are. Are you a pawn grabber, or are you not a pawn grabber? You can always go for something like queen to h4 check, and after king moves, simply rook captures on c4. Grab a nice pawn, and after queen captures, rook captures, and then hope you can win a 4 versus 3 endgame. Fabiano is not a pawn grabber, so instead he goes queen to h6. A very nice move, keeping all of his options open, and black doesn't really have a good move here. Here, king to f7. Mamedyarov didn't really see any ideas behind queen to h6, or perhaps he did, but he's hoping for Caruana to repeat moves and perhaps get a draw by threefold repetition. And this is, I left the quote above the board by Ivan Sokolov. It's easy to tweet when your engine does all the work, because this is the position Ivan Sokolov had in mind during the live coverage, where he said, like, where is the win? I don't see the win. And everyone was like, yeah, there's a win in the comments. And, well, feel free to pause the video here and try to find this idea everyone was tweeting about. I'll give you a couple of seconds as usual. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations. You are an excellent follower of my all of my other social media, as like in the previous video I have already mentioned this. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, the idea is g4. A very poisonous move, threatening to bust open the king side here, but also, if black isn't careful, even g5 is an idea. For example, now if you try something like rook to e8, now you get queen to h7 check, and now king to f6 is no longer possible because g5 check. A beautiful move where now if you capture it, you get queen to h4 checkmate. Very nice idea. And if you don't capture it, if you play something like king to a5, king to e5, you get queen captures on g6, and now there is no defense against f4 checkmate. Or you can prevent f4 by pushing f4 yourself, but then you get queen to e4 checkmate. Very nicely done. So after king to f7, Caruana didn't find this tweety move, and instead he goes queen to d2, a more human-like idea, simply preparing a rook to d7. Mamedyarov defends it, rook to c7, and now we have rook to h4, again threatening rook to h7 to simply win the queen and the game. King to f6, Mamedyarov tries to run away, but now queen to d4 check. Queen to e5 blocking, now comes queen to b6 check. King to g7, and now queen to b8. Now the queen traveled all this way to now get back to the dh file. King to f6, and now queen to h8 with check. King to e6, and now comes queen to g8 with check. And here you don't really have a lot of options. If you block with the rook, rook to h7, a double attack, queen to f6 blocking, and now queen to e8 check. Queen has to block, or you move the king and then the rook is lost, so queen has to block, and now queen to c6 check. King to e5, and now f4 will again be checkmate, as the pawn and queen are conveniently covering all of these squares. So after a queen to g8 check, king to f6 was played, but now comes rook to d4. Again, a very nice move. So what do you play here? If you try something like rook to e7 with some hopes of doing something here along the e file, queen to f8 is the idea. Rook to f7, and again queen checks. Rook to g7, and now again a double attack, and there's no way to guard the rook. So after this, rook to d4, queen to e7 was played, and now rook to d8. There's white is just pressuring here. There's really nothing to do, and more importantly, this is move 59. Mamedyarov is extremely low on time, and this is move one move to the second time control. So you have to make it to move 60 to be given additional time. So here with rook to d7, black could still hope to survive a bit longer and perhaps even survive the game. But here Mamedyarov, for his move that reaches time control, played king to g5, and now it is all over. Fabiano played f4 with check. We have king to h5, and now Mamedyarov saw precisely that if something like queen to h8 is played, king to g4 comes, and now there are no more checks. Perhaps black can recover, but still it would be very hard after king to f2, as the king doesn't really have anywhere to go. So after this, king to h5, rook to d2 was played. Here now Fabi is threatening rook to h2, and there really isn't anything to do here anymore. Queen to g7 was played. If you try something like king to g4 immediately, again queen to g6 is now coming, as the queen is now not on h8. So after rook to d2, queen to g7, offering a queen trade, but now Fabi ends the game in great style. We have rook to h2 check, king goes to g4, and now we have king to g2. A very nice symbolic queen sacrifice to end the game. The idea is, of course, if the queen is captured, if the queen is captured, then rook to h4 will be checkmate. So g4 was Mamedyarov's last attempt to try and survive this game, but after queen to e8, and this is move 64, he decided to resign the game. As there is no defense, either queen to h5 will be checkmate or queen to e2 will be checkmate. You can't prevent both threats. So yeah, that's the game. I do hope you enjoyed it, and just so I don't forget, here are the results across the boards. Caruana has defeated Mamedyarov, a very nice win, a win against a 2820 player, and as you'll see, this win brings Caruana even closer to the #1 rated chess player in the world, Magnus Carlsen. Wesley lost to Timur Rajabov. Nakamura drew his game against Arkady Naidich, and Sam Shankland won a very nice game against Rauf Mamedov. So the United States win against Azerbaijan with a result of 2.5 to 1.5. A very important win, as with this win, I believe, haven't checked the results, but I believe the United States are now in first place. But it will be a clash against Poland tomorrow. So again, a tough game for Caruana against young Duda. So there we have it. These are the live ratings. So as you can see, Caruana is now 34.5, so less than 5 points to Magnus Carlsen, and it would be very interesting if he could catch up to him before November. So it would be, well, for the first time, Carlsen is playing a World Chess Championship match where he's not only a much higher rated player, but actually a lower rated player. But, you know, doesn't really matter. Ratings are ratings, you know. So yeah, like I said, I do hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're enjoying the coverage of the Olympiad so far. I would like to thank Stephen Green, James Radovich, Mario Encinosa, Christian Gonzalez del Castillo, although perhaps it's even Christian, I believe, and Alexandru Epuran for a contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot, I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check 2 of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you soon, hopefully with some more interesting games. Thank you all, and I'll see you soon.